Welcome everybody at this CCSS meeting number 56. I'm Henk Dijkstra, I'm the director of this institute, and I'm really happy to welcome Prof. Alkemade here. She is a full professor and chair of economics and governance of technological innovation at the TU Eindhoven. She got also her PhD in 2004 at the Eindhoven University. And then, came here to Copernicus Institute, where she was for a long time, until 2015. And since then, she's in Eindhoven as this chair position. She got an ESC consolidated grant just recently, 2022, and I heard just from her, so she's going to talk about that now.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's nice to be back in Utrecht. Yes, so for Alkemade, I understand this is quite a broad, complexity interested, very nice to see, complexity interested audience. So my presentation is also quite general. I have a background in artificial intelligence, and then I did my PhD at the Center for Mathematics and Computer Science and to Eindhoven on agent-based modeling. Then I moved into sustainability, first at Copernicus, and then in Eindhoven, where I'm in a more social science department, and I've been there ever since. So my work is very much complexity inspired, and I will try to make the links visible throughout the presentation, but I would not classify myself as someone who really adds to the state of the art on complexity research. So in that sense, the presentation is maybe also a bit more applied than you're sometimes used to. So I want to talk to you a little bit about my recent project on fostering social tipping dynamics to accelerate sustainability transitions. We only started a couple of months ago. I'm in the middle of the process of hiring the last 2 PhD students on it, so it's very exciting times. And I want to talk a little bit about how this project came about, what the motivations are, and of course how we try to really use complexity insights to ultimately have an impact on sustainability. So first on the motivation. Climate policy, as the Dutch climate policy, European climate policy, relies very heavily on large-scale models. The integrated assessment models. I think we have you have some very strong groups on this here in Utrecht with Detlef van Vuren, and these models they're very interesting, but they typically do not really capture the diffusion of key technologies very well. It's also a question of scales, and these models work on very different scales of aggregation and time scales than emergent innovation processes. And as an example, so this graph shows the yearly forecasts by the International Energy Agency for the worldwide increase of solar power. And what you see is that, so the blue lines are the yearly forecasts. So what you see is that year after year, they predicted linear future growth, also because the International Energy Agency bases their predictions more or less on firm policy plans, so not just on ambitions, etc. So there's also don't want to be too hard on them, but year after year you show. So for example, here you see the 2015 predictions where they predict that there will be another something between 50 and 60 gigawatts added, but already in the next year you see that it's actually a lot more. And so linear growth is predicted, whereas in reality we observe this really steep increase in this case of solar, There are some other technologies where you see the same patterns. So electric vehicles are a good example, where also was much faster than predicted for many years. There are also some technologies. Typically, there's this very nice work by Charlie Wilson and colleagues on this, that the more lumpy technologies like nuclear energy, they typically slow much slower growth than predicted. They're typically more costly, projects always overrun in terms of budget and also time. So nuclear is an example. Also carbon capture and storage, which of course plays a large role in many of the scenarios that will still keep us in below the 2 degrees increase. CCS is also an example where these expectations are not met. So it's not the case that for all sustainable technologies, the prediction goes wrong in the same direction, but for smaller technologies, that where you have lots of units to learn and to scale, typically predictions lag behind what we see in reality. Now, this is of course an interesting question. So the people at the International Energy Agency really know a lot about technology, so why can't they predict it a little bit better? So there's a scientific knowledge gap there, but it also has real world impact. And because these models and their predictions, they are then picked up, used in a very sparse way in some of the IAMs, but also very much used in policy. And if you don't expect this type of growth, you will also not plan accordingly. So you will not invest in the required infrastructure to make sure that all that additional wind and solar capacity actually can be transported. And some of that we see now. So the grid operators in the Netherlands have been warning already for a long time that there would be congestion problems, and investments have really lagged behind what was needed. And now actually we're in a phase where this congestion is hampering the further energy transition, because companies that want to connect a solar park or a wind turbine, they have to wait for a very long time, or they cannot do so without all sorts of alternative options. So these expectations, in a way, what we call in science and technology studies, are performative. So they do have an effect in the real world. So it's very important to get these models right, not just to know better, to have more truthful models, but also really because they do have an effect on policy and on sustainability transitions. So this was really the starting point of the project. Now, one of the things that is missing in these existing models are many of these feedbacks, and that's where complexity comes in a little bit. So the existing models, to some extent, they have learning curves or learning rates in there. So when a technology typically, so the learning curves describe how much the cost of the technology reduces when the number of units produced doubles, typically a measure, but it's often also portrayed as just cost reductions per year. And it's, for many technologies, this is a remarkable steady number. So it's quite high. For solar, you see fast learning. You also see faster learning in relatively young technologies, and slower learning in these lumpy technologies, or technologies that have already gone through the learning curve or that are close to their sort of theoretically possible performance, like combustion engines. So you can have some efficiency gains there, but they're already quite efficient compared to what is theoretically possible. So you know, that you can only do so much. So one of the things that is missing is these feedbacks, and many of those feedbacks, in the case of these technologies, they actually originate more from the social domain. So they don't necessarily come from huge breakthroughs in learning or technological innovation. It plays an important role, also because when technologies are very popular, investments in the technologies increase. But in many cases, like for solar, the German policy was very important. So they created a policy where they would really support the technology for a long time, creating certainty for all stakeholders in that technology. And that really boosted the technology and learning in solar technology worldwide. So many of those processes that led to positive feedbacks and increased learning are actually not necessarily technological or innovation related, but also very much rooted in the social domain. And in this project, we try to capture these processes a little bit better, maybe also quantify them and then model them so that we ultimately can make these technology predictions and expectations models a bit better. So that is the overall goal. And the focus area is sustainability transitions. And we started with transitions in energy and mobility simply because there also it matters a lot. If you make the transition there, you already make a big dent in emissions. So that's why we are interested in those domains. So that is a bit the starting point. So we have this observation that we have this inaccurate models, and one reason that may be the case is that some feedbacks and interactions within and with the social and the socio-economic system are missing. And at the same time, in sort of the more climate science and environmental science domain, this topic of social tipping points was gaining traction. So there were two very influential papers, and now there's already quite a range, where they said, well, this so we're getting dangerously close to several climate tipping points, but maybe activating some social tipping points, maybe, and that's the next paper I will show on the next slide. Maybe our only hope to have climate action fast enough to stay within the 1.5 to 2 degrees warming. And in this, so here the social tipping points, they are conceptualized as small interventions, typically in socio-economic realm, that will have a very large effect on emissions. And these social tipping points, and so they were. It's a bit complicated because here they come from the analogy with climate tipping points, but of course in the social sciences and in psychology and social networks, there are already also conceptualizations of tipping points within a person and within a network. But here it is very much framed in analogy to this climate tipping point. So where you are in some undesirable state and you want to go to some more desirable decarbonized state, and some social interventions can help you sort of smooth the path from one, it's probably not going to be an equilibrium if we talk about social processes, but from one somewhat stable state to another. And these social tipping points, they were then, in this paper they did basically a lot of expert interviews on, okay, what could these social tipping points be and where are the most promising social tipping points? And the tipping points they identified were also a bit sort of the usual suspects that you see in the IPCC reports. If you focus on the energy system, making sure that energy technologies are cost competitive with fossil fuel based energy technologies, that would be an important social tipping point. So then you already see that many of these social tipping points that were identified in these papers are very economic and cost-based in nature. And the early tipping points here identified are also very technological. So it's maybe a bit different from what you would expect for social tipping points. Other things that were mentioned are a bit more in the social realm, like the expert panel from the paper saw tipping points in shifts of norms and values, which is of course very interesting. But then if you would tell a social scientist, yeah, we have identified a very nice social tipping point to save the climate, all you have to do is just change the norms and values of all the people. It's not so easy. And there's also, so now we're searching very hard for sort of evidence and quantifiable evidence of where, and you see some nice examples. And of course, the COVID pandemic was an interesting time in this respect, because there you really did see some norm change, and also a lot of behavior change. But at the same time, it also becomes very clear that if you are talking about social tipping points, it's really a challenge to make sure that it sticks. Oh. So it's, and that's really different from these climate tipping points, where in many cases, if you have tipped, it's irreversible. Not in all cases, but in most cases, it is irreversible. And it's also, even if it's reversible, it's not so easy. Whereas if you are talking about behavior, in many cases, it is not so easy to make it stick. So that is also another whole field of research. How do you change these social practices and routines? But that is one big difference between the ecological tipping points that were the sort of the starting point for looking at social tipping points from this view, and the social tipping points. Now, then in the second paper, I already spoiled it a little bit. So where they said, well, these upward scaling tipping cascades, and these tipping cascades are basically feedbacks between different tipping points, where one event or sets in motion a series of others, and then in the end you really do end up in a new state that is then somewhat irreversible. So one example they also give is that the German PV policies that I just described, at some point, because when you build a whole industry around it and there's many jobs, it becomes more and more difficult to really reverse that policy, because it becomes entrenched in society. And that's also the idea. If you have not just the one tipping point, but really the series, so to have the analogy with the pandemic, if that would have been followed up by, very strict policies on working from home, instead of many businesses saying, no, you have to come back and back and back, maybe we would have been able to keep some of the emissions reductions from that time, whereas now it didn't stick in most cases. So there was not this continuous entrenchment of the new behavior. So here they give some examples on how this could work for electric vehicles. And typically Norway is given here as the perfect example, and Norway has quite successful EV policy, which is not necessarily the sort of the obvious country to see that, just as Germany is not the obvious country to expect huge advantages for solar power. So with electric vehicles, the batteries typically have a bit difficulty in the cold. Norway has large distances in some areas, which is also not very helpful if there's range anxiety for the electric vehicles. But they had a clever policy, but they also have very deep pockets. So it's an interesting question. Can you do this sequencing of policies? Maybe with a little less money, is it also available for other countries? And then the question that we are interested in is say, well, okay, this is very nice, and you can also plot it very well and reason how this works. If you've seen it, and with EVs, it's now quite clear that it is highly competitive. So we wanted to say, okay, can you also do it for other technologies? And then together with Auke Hoekstra, who's also in Eindhoven, he's a sort of big proponent of electric driving. So it's good to set the stage. So you know, we wanted to do this for electric trucks. And here you see the Tesla truck. It is actually already available, but only but they are much behind schedule in terms of rollout and diffusion. There were lots of delays, and I think now Pepsi has some of these trucks driving, and some other companies. So they are actually on the road. The actual trucks look a little bit less sleek than this, but I like this picture. So I didn't put in another. And if you look at, and of course, so we started again with a technological example, mainly because, as I said, the project just started, and we really need to first collect a lot more data to also target some of the tipping points where these social processes are more important. So we started with a technological one, and also because Auke really is a strong expert on this topic, and so this was a good thing to work on together. So if you look at this list of possible social tipping points and also tipping interventions, what you see is that the cost of fossil-free technologies is an important one. Regulation can play an important role, but on the more behavioral side, there's processes on the demand side that can lead to positive feedback, and also changes in norms and behaviors that can lead to positive feedback. Although for trucking, that is of course not so obvious, and this is one thing I do want to make very clear, but maybe first go to the impacts of each truck. So transport is interesting because not only because it has a sort of substantial part in emissions, but also it's one of the few sectors where it's still growing. Also in developed countries, where it's in energy, it's declining, and in industry it's a bit unclear because we've had this strange year, of course. But transport in that sense is problematic, because it's still growing, and of course we also expect a lot of growth in countries that are currently still growing a lot in terms of economies. So that's why transport is interesting and important. But if you think about sustainability transitions, and that becomes, I think, very clear in countries where space is limited, like the Netherlands. If you replace every car by an electric vehicle, if you replace every truck by an electric truck, of course that saves a lot of emissions, but that does not necessarily mean that you end up with a sort of sustainable system. And in transition studies, we do like to see this transition a little bit broader than just swapping technologies, because if the models that or the results that behind that I will show you later, they include the current growth scenarios for transport, which are so it is expected to grow, whereas in a sort of sustainable situation, you would also like transport to decline a bit. Or if you move to a circular economy, maybe there will still be a lot of transport, but for sure the patterns of transport will be very different. So that is not included in the results, and we will even see that if you take into account a decline, which may be desirable for a lot of reasons, that is actually a balancing feedback here. So that does not really help to move to electric trucks. some other, this is from the latest IPCC report. So it's not the entire figure, to be clear, it's just, here you see the transport bit, and what you see there is that the change to electric light duty vehicles and also electric heavy duty vehicles, it's depicted in gray, meaning in this case, if you read the figure, that yeah, it is thought to have to be a good contribution. This is what I think Cornelis Blok called it a hit list of things you can do if you want to save the climate. But it's in gray, meaning that the uncertainty is very high, that there is disagreement. So that's also another reason why it's interesting to look at these trucks. Okay, so on to the trucks. So I learned so much about trucks while working on it. I actually also, we went to one of those burrs, places where you have all the newest innovations in mobility, and we climbed in the in the trucks and looked at the battery. It's very nice. So with electric trucks, so they are what you saw from the Tesla picture is that it looks a bit different from a conventional truck, and that is important for this story, and that is important also if you are interested in learning curves and feedbacks, because innovation is not just sort of swapping one thing for another, but if you have one innovation, it may also enable other innovations, and then you get these feedbacks that are very difficult to include if you just continue on a single learning curve. So what happens is, first you have the conventional truck, then you can replace the motor and the tanks by electric motor and batteries. Then you can change the design of the truck a little bit, because it makes more sense to have components at different places from a sort of weight and stability perspective. I think this is what Tesla does, and they're also already experimenting with this one, where they integrate really the battery in the frame of the truck. Because for electric trucks, the big problem until recently was simply the weight of the battery. So trucking is a low margin business. So if the space in your truck is taken up by batteries, you earn less, and this is not a good thing. So the weight of the battery was a big sort of focus of innovation, and of course also the efficiency and the range of the battery was a big, and they're related, of course. And what we try to do, so let me show you. What we try to do here is to get some of these feedbacks in the predictions is we estimated learning rates for all relevant components from historical data, from expert estimates. So there are many of these papers where they say, oh, this is probably going to happen, also from trade fairs, etc. And then you can estimate learning curves. For some of these learning curves, learning rates were very high. So we actually took over one that was a bit more conservative or in line with bodies like the International Energy Agency, if it was really much more, if you would just look at the historical data. But then what we also did is we inserted the more radical innovations. So we didn't just sort of continue all the learning curves, but we said, well, okay, they expect these structural batteries, for example, to occur in 2025. We include them at that time. So what would that then mean for other components of the truck, etc., etc. So we really engineered also these learning curves to reflect expected developments, and continuously, especially Alkemade this sort of sanity check. Okay, does this make sense to still have it like this? What is this likely? Can we check this? And then we combine these in an overall learning curve for the truck. So here you see some of our sort of the values that we used eventually. So we really split it up in many components. There's much more in the models, but this gives you a bit of an example. And also we included things about really the operational costs of the truck. Because for trucks, it's not really the purchase price that is the most important thing, but it's total cost of ownership over the lifetime of the truck. So as soon as you are below the cost of the conventional diesel truck, you have an attractive proposition with your e-truck. Now, what we see here, and these figures are a bit strange. That is something we are still working on to find out how we can depict this. So if we calculated the learning curves, but that means that if you go backwards, there are some trucks here that did not exist yet. So this is something we do have to make clear because they only start to really appear right here. So that is good to take into account. But then you see that already soonish, before 2030, these electric trucks will be an attractive option in the market for most users. So we distinguish between national trucks. So most of the trucks, and depends a bit, it's different. We looked at Europe mostly, it's different for the US, but most of the trucks return home every night. So that also means that they can charge at the depot, at their home station, which is much cheaper than if they have to charge at the fast charging station along the highways. And it also much reduces the infrastructure requirements. So if you calculate the infrastructure simply from the number of trucks, it is very different because typically diesel trucks, they always go to a gas station. So that is a big difference. You have to take that into account. Then we looked at international trucks, and we also looked at optimized fleets. So if you, if most of your trips are not to southern Spain, then also most of your trucks do not need a battery that can get you there. So we looked. We assumed that fleet owners would sort of buy the trucks that they would actually sort of need, given their current transport patterns. And that's of course a bit strange if you look this way forward and you also hope that other things will change. So there are some assumptions in there. Yes?
Why are the diesel lines increasing and the electric lines decreasing? And also, what exactly is on the y-axis? I'm just trying to understand the picture.
Yes. So there's the total cost of ownership, and for diesel they are increasing for example because we do expect a carbon price there, which does not affect the electric. And at the same time, we have also included some learning effects for the diesel trucks because some of the developments in aerodynamics, they also, they benefit the diesel trucks just like they benefit the e-trucks. So we try to be fair there in all of that. Yes. Okay, so what did we learn from doing this? Apart from the observation that e-trucks are a good idea, and also compared to hydrogen, you can really service fulfill your trucking needs with electric trucks. So what we found is that systematically collecting all this data does give you a bit more information in identifying these positive feedbacks and tipping points than just looking at the learning curve and projecting it, which of course is not very surprising, but we were kind of happy that it could be done, that especially for technologies, that information is out there. And of course, Alk is really an expert on trucking, so it would be very much more difficult to do that for other technologies. what it also allowed us to do to identify additional positive feedbacks in the system that we don't, that you typically don't grasp if you do this learning curve analysis. Like the reduced need for maintenance, which is a big thing for the truck owners, and also the effects of infrastructure rollout. So this allowed us to be a bit more specific in exactly what infrastructure is needed and how this can be done. But also we noticed that some feedbacks, even in this analysis, they remained unclear. Like the interaction with the energy system, this could be on the one hand a balancing feedback because it is an additional strain on the energy system. Depends of course a lot on where you put these fast chargers also, but it could also be a reinforcing feedback if you use these charging stations maybe with batteries to really also provide services for the energy system. So that one could go both ways. And the other one that we're not so sure about is, what if you move to more sustainable patterns of consumption? If you have lower transport demands, if you move to more circular, maybe more local, transportation system. So that one is also difficult to calculate. But what we did find, or at least that is our estimate here, is that for all these balancing feedbacks and the ones that are uncertain, that is actually where policy can play a key role. So that are your sensitive intervention points for policy. If you talk about, okay, how can you really set in motion these positive feedbacks? So if you do not just sort of wait for the interaction with the energy system to go wrong, but rather plan for it in a smart way. And I think we may have to, because there's now European regulation coming on these fast charging stations among the main transport corridors. But you have to if you are really smart about it, it can be a reinforcement feedback. If you're not, it will indeed be a hindrance to e-truck rollout, and you may end up with hydrogen, whereas electric might be, or is, according at least to our modeling, cheaper overall, also for society. So in that sense, such an analysis also gives you a bit of a handle on identifying these key intervention points for policy. So all in all, I really enjoyed the exercise, and this gives a first peek into the results of our social tipping points project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. There are obviously questions, I suppose. So who starts? There are also people online, right? Amy?
Maybe.
Oh, no. Okay. So, okay, then I'll start. So it's important, to identify the feedbacks, but also identify the strength of the feedbacks. Because you can be positive, but if it's really, eventually marginal effect, so can you do that with this analysis?
In this case, yes, because in the end we translate everything to effect on this total cost of ownership. But if you are interested, for example, and this is not my area of expertise, so it's a guess, but if you are another big one from a climate perspective is changes in diets, for example. And there I think it would be much harder to have such a clear single variable where you can translate all the effects. So in that sense, I think here it can be done, but also because it's a nice clear-cut technology-driven case. So the more you move away from technology and in towards the sort of behavioral realm, I think it will be more difficult. But again, it's maybe someone who knows a lot about that system will hopefully disagree.
Well, yeah.
Can you maybe say a bit more about these learning curves and how you fit or predict them?
Yes.
So you had this like this large table with a lot of learning rates, I think. So
Yeah.
one of the things was the weight of the truck or something.
Yes.
And I think there was, well, a certain learning rate, which probably means that the weight gets lower per year.
Yes.
So do you actually just look at historic data of weights of trucks and then you fit some exponential curve downwards?
Yes. So there are different models for these learning curves, and they're typically there are different formulas. Don't really give very different effects. Which one some are based on scaling in the units. Some are based on improvements over time. So it's curve fitting through historic data. But then we also did this sort of sanity check. So you know that there are theoretical limits on some improvements, and also that at some point you will see more radical innovations. Similar for the batteries. So if you expect so we now see a lot of innovation in batteries. For example, there's a lot of questions on resources needed to move to electric trucks or all electric applications. So because of these concerns, there's a lot of innovation effort into alternative battery chemistries, etc., etc. And these alternative batteries, they may have some advantages, but also some disadvantages. So if we include the novel technologies, we again carefully look, okay, but what does this mean for all the other parameters in the model?
How has the rebound effect been taken into account?
Yeah, that's so. I'm not sure if that plays a role here because
maybe give an example. If batteries become cheaper to produce and therefore shipping becomes cheaper, people end up buying more online, for example. So maybe one deterrent of people purchasing things online is because shipping is expensive. Therefore, consumption goes up with purchasing online, shipping goes up, and therefore consumption goes up, even though the price, the total cost has gone down.
So again, I'm kind of hoping that a carbon tax will dampen that, but it's also good to know that it is really a low margin business. So one of the reasons that we have some really strange sort of supply chains or global supply chains is because shipping is ridiculously cheap, or at least does not reflect the true costs. So in that sense, I'm not sure if advances in transport will have if these rebound effects will most likely be larger if it's cost reductions or income increases in other domains. It does not add that much to the price of the goods. Nevertheless, so as I said, so these models, they include a growth scenario for trucking that is sort of based on what we've seen over the past few years, and that in itself is, of course, undesirable. So, and the other way around, it is difficult. It becomes more difficult to switch if the trucking business is going through hard times. So that's why this more sustainable patterns of demand feedback is a bit unclear. So can we create the right conditions so even if trucking is in difficult times, that they will still switch or not? But on the rebound effect, so we simply have not modeled the demand side to that extent. Just looked at the forecast for the sector.
So as a social scientist, I'm obviously really happy to hear your emphasis on the social aspects of the energy transition. But still, I wonder to what extent your modeling approach really takes into account the social processes that underlies. For example, what is the role of agency in your model? You described it as mostly curve fitting. Doesn't sound like there's a lot of agency. So are the
No, yeah, that's of course absolutely right. And so this is a very technology driven example. In terms of agency, we did try to really understand how fleet owners make these decisions. So in that sense, so that's where the heterogeneity of the fleets and the ideas about that they would prefer to charge at the depot rather than fast charge and things like that. So that is in there, which is touches a bit on their preferences and behaviors. One thing that is advocated for the trucking sector to switch are ways to stimulate the demand side to demand more sustainable transport, and there. So one idea was to create an instrument where because this is difficult because in the beginning there's still a limited number of trucks. So there may be demand for sustainable transport. So I may be willing to pay a little bit more to have my goods delivered to me sustainably, but then it's very difficult to match my demands to a specific, one of the few clean trucks that is driving around. So one of the ideas is a platform where you sort of pool that supply and through a credit type of system make sure that there is actually a match between sustainable demand and supply in a way that that these extra revenues do stimulate the sector to further green. And that is, of course, a very much a social process. One other thing, but this is not so much for the heavy duty trucking, but more for the last mile, is that this idea that if you order something today, that you have it tomorrow. I know almost no one who finds that really important. And I've asked a lot of people. So it's so also there. So it's So these are also things that we want to look into. So how can you make changes on the demand side that will lead to a better offer of sustainable options. But it's currently not in there.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Anne. I work at the National Institute for Public Health and the Environment. I think it's a very interesting presentation. I was wondering also, so this is, if I understand it correctly, it's a system dynamics model, right? That's behind this, or was it like a multi-model?
No, it's really just the learning curves that we included. So it uses a bit the system dynamics ideas of feedbacks to identify, okay, which one should we include and translate to learning curves, but it's not in itself a system dynamics model.
Ah, okay. Because I was wondering indeed, maybe two things, like to what extent indeed it would be helpful to maybe apply either more even more formal system dynamics modeling, or on another hand, maybe combining it with agent-based modeling if you want to get more insights into the social behavior, to get insight into the tipping points. And on the other hand, I was curious how that actually, because these models are sometimes also difficult if we then want policymakers to understand it.
Yeah.
And I wonder also if you had already interaction with policymakers, and if it also gave for them really new insights, or if it was still.
Yeah. So on this, we have quite good links with policy. Also on the agent-based modeling, but that's not this project, but Alke and I are also together in another project, which is called NEON. It's focused on the Netherlands, and there we do agent-based and system dynamics, but mostly agent-based modeling of the energy and mobility transition. And one thing they did, for example, there is they built an agent-based model of the Rotterdam harbor with trucks. Also to get an insight of, okay, so where do these trucks go? How many of them really go far? So what would be needed to really electrify this bit of the transport system? Because apparently many of them, they do Rotterdam Venlo. That's a big thing. And it's So those models that really provide these smaller insights that of course then they find their way in these in more aggregated models, but it's super useful, and I'm trying to sort of convince one of my PhD students that it would be very nice to now make a model of the fast charging along the European transport corridors. But the debate is not settled yet.
All right. And so policymakers, it's useful for them.
Yeah, well, especially agent-based models, because it's so tangible. So and not necessarily. I don't think they're necessarily the most useful in providing firm results, but what they are very good for is communicating complexity. So also one of the PhD students from the NEOM project, together with Alke, they developed a model of the energy system of Brabant. They got this question from Brabant province on whether they could be sort of self-sustaining in terms of renewable energy. And they took a piece of the coast of Zealand to make this happen. So it's an interesting question. But they presented this agent-based model in the Provinciale Staten, so the provincial government, and there it just really helped to get across that it is indeed quite complex, that there are no easy solutions, and that it's all connected, and if you change something here, it has effects there. So for that, I think agent-based models are really nice to just help people understand that that it is important to look at all these feedbacks and potentially unintended consequences before you say, oh, let's go right or let's go left. So there it's really nice. And you said you were from the Health Institute. We did not include health benefits in this model, but of course it makes sense from a societal cost perspective to include especially for people living along the highways.
Yes. We're going to learn about that.
I think that was
Yeah, I was wondering, what is the role of or how do you estimate uncertainties because of unknowns? I mean, electric vehicles for a number of years we thought, well, this is the best thing that can happen for transport in the sense of environment, but now we are increasingly more aware that they destroy the high altitude deserts in South America, for example. So this knowledge will certainly have some impact, and not only just how the transition goes, but also the total cost of the environment.
Yes.
How do you take these into account?
Yeah, no, that's a very fair question. So what we did in this specific paper is there's so it's not included in the model, but there is a section where we sort of address all these resource concerns, both scarcity and discuss the metals where, especially these environmental or for example, the labor conditions are a large concern. So we discuss all those and also identify some alternative technologies that are being developed where some of these materials are not needed or are needed much less, or but overall, if you compare just in terms of land use, the footprint, which is a very crude measure of a system using e-trucks with a system using diesel trucks and oil, it's less for the e-trucks. The problem is that it's new locations becoming compromised, and of course the old locations are not necessarily easily restored. So it's a question we for sure do not solve, but we also don't want to hide it. So yeah, we have quite an extensive section on it in the paper.
Yeah, thanks, Floor. What I like of these models is that it's empirically grounded in particular parameters and relationships and history and future. So I have 3 questions about this, and maybe you can elaborate. One is, okay, what tipping points did you identify? Because for me, the model is just we have current equilibrium, and we will not move to the other equilibrium unless there's some policy intervention, because now it's too expensive. So what is kind of the timing of policy interventions that you can derive from this? And second question is more about where it's in the model. The typical question, is this or that in the model? Is hydrogen in the model? Because if hydrogen also diffuses, it can have both positive and negative effects. Did you go into the engineering as far as to say there may be some variables that reach a plateau in the learning curve? For example, I was thinking about weight. I think a truck cannot be too light because then it will blow away by the wind. So did you also go in that level of detail, and maybe you may find a constraint there?
Yes. So to the last one, yes. So although for your weight example, that is of course currently electric trucks have a higher weight allowance on European roads to help them a little bit. So that concern will not sort of occur for quite some time.
Okay.
And of course, you can always put in more cargo if it's.
Sometimes you're empty.
Yeah. So, but that's another thing. So there are many empty rides, and there's also. I just saw a report from another project where just by data sharing, they reduced 20% of the emissions on some logistics routes. So also there, it's huge potential. So that we also should not neglect. So hydrogen is in the model, but not in the sense that you mean, because we just suggest, well, this is not something you should want. So it's because you always have to convert it back and forth. So it's always going to be.
The lobby is very strong.
It is, yes.
It's
yes.
maybe,
So that's also. No, it is a very, and then of course, it's a very strong lobby.
Especially in Germany.
Yeah, but it is growing quite fast, and there is no or negligible hydrogen infrastructure. So in that sense, we have to see.
The tipping points or the policy, could you identify?
Yes. So interestingly, so what we show is that from a total cost of ownership perspective, the tipping point is already more or less there. So you could, it takes a time to get your truck, so you could basically start ordering. So what are the tipping points is to provide the charging infrastructure, and that requires something like, for example, a feed-in tariff for the charge point operators, because in the beginning there will be only a few trucks, but you have to roll out the entire infrastructure. So there is this European regulation, so it'll be very interesting to see how this will be implemented, and that typically the Netherlands are quite good in implementing these things, which can already so it in terms of trucking hubs, so the Netherlands could be a country here that really pulls the technology through the learning curve a little bit. So that is a big tipping point. And I think that the infra would be the main one. And the other one, but it's not really a tipping point, but the other thing that we identified is very important is to stimulate also from the resource concerns perspective, really the developments in these new alternative battery chemistries, but also make sure that these are open, that they can be sort of immediately used in the new trucks. So that is also important one.
Okay. Well, thank you very much again for coming here, for giving this nice question and discussion.
Very nice.
So we have a little present for you, easy to take with you.
Yeah.
Okay, let's thank Florian. And see you all at the next event.